Okay, thank you, Andrew, and thanks to Lisa for teeing me up for this. I understand it's a provocation, so I feel I should sort of take a breath to try and reflect a bit on the last speaker's contribution, because it is I'm moving from ethnography of anthropology now to some of the political economy questions that I think came up in his talk. I don't want to provoke him by asking about the limits of anthropology in emergency conditions. And the question of, I think he raised a very interesting point about the instrumentalization of social science. And I'm going to unashamedly say that what I'm going to talk about is very instrumental. I do have the privilege of working with anthropologists and ethnographers at the moment. Very, very interesting, very, very insightful, very frustrating as well, because I never know when anthropology ends and you have enough information. And in an emergency situation, I suppose you have to become instrumental otherwise, and certainly for this audience, you have to think that there has to be a term on the information you can collect in every disease and episode in medical and veterinary emergencies is specific. And anyway, that's my first provocation. I'm called for perhaps kicking somebody when he's already sat down. My second provocation was to crunch what was effectively a word soup invented by Lisa, very, 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 very informative word soup, down into something that I could actually deal with, which was this title, Reconciling Livestock with Sustainable Planetary Health. As I go forward, in hopefully less than half an hour, I'll glide over some of the terminology that was in the original title, namely public goods and I think sustainable intensification. So I'll define sustainable livestock, if you like, and concepts of planetary health. I'll reflect on some policy options, noting who you are and what this centre's for, without getting too specific about what should be done in a normative sense. This will inevitably bring me to some situation where there's a juxtaposition between instruments to deal with production, externalities and public goods, and those that are specific to consumption, externalities and public goods. And as with the previous speaker, there are some epistemological challenges about is my perspective well informed? Does it land very well with a room of epidemiologists and veterinary scientists? And is it too instrumental? And what do you not have in the room to answer some of the challenges that we're facing? So, sustainable livestock. I can draw on from my one-eyed or kind of narrow-minded disciplinary perspective decades of research on sustainability, which basically tells me that I can define a state of the world where there are livestock and where we're consuming meat or not consuming meat as either improving global well-being, welfare, or reducing it. And that's within our own generation and across different generations, and that's a standard definition of sustainability. If you don't like the word welfare, and I don't mean animal welfare here, I mean human welfare, our well-being. And so I've immediately, if you don't like well-being, use happiness. Okay, I'll come back to that later on. I've immediately jumped into a paradigm of the neoclassical, or the so-called mainstream economic view of defining sustainability. If we think of the world with livestock in it or not in it, do these entities, do these animals, do these beings, do they increase our welfare or do they reduce it? I mean, if we'd asked that question 10, 15, 20 years ago, unambiguously the answer would have been yes. If I go and ask a post-millennial, well, they like livestock in the environment, they like livestock in landscapes, but they probably don't like us eating and consuming livestock products, and they probably had something to say about the way we house and steward livestock. So in fact, over generations, you can already see that the way we understand, the way we produce, the way we conceptualize systems of livestock are not guaranteed to improve the welfare of different generations. So that's my first point. If we want to notwithstanding that point, make systems more sustainable, we can think about internalizing the damage that they do. So if we think of livestock who are a source of greenhouse gases, then we can think about trying to understand, well, what is that value? That negative spillover from a livestock system, can we quantify it, can we value it? can we put it back into the system so to speak, to reach some optimal or near optimal or more socially acceptable level of production, accounting for those spillovers. Now, the definition of an externality here is more or less textbook. In the case of greenhouse gases, we could be talking about epidemics and zoonoses. We could also be talking about positive externalities or so-called public goods. You know, the idea that people do like livestock in the environment and they have a role in some ecosystems, not least in Scotland, but in many other countries in the world. And we can start talking about the juxtaposition of this debate in developed and developing countries. So while I can go on to pinpoint where these externalities and public goods are in our production systems, and I can start wagging my finger at livestock producers in the UK and saying, well, you're clearly unsustainable in the light of the externalities that you're producing and not paying for. The pushback will come from the livestock community, the FAO, developing world, lower and middle income country producers who will then tell me, actually, you know, these things, this is an agenda that is predominantly a northern fiction. We have to grow, we have to develop with livestock, and we have to consume livestock and get up the same development curve that you already did. And by the way, most of the burden of livestock externalities is a northern problem. So that there's pushback there that we have to bear in mind. Okay, this is a rather busy slide where I can kind of help you understand or see where all the externalities and public goods are. So if we kind of deconstruct livestock production systems, you can see that we have, on the input side, a whole range of externalities related to land use, habitat encroachment, species loss, and so on. We're seeing a lot of hysteria, or more than hysteria, genuine concern perhaps about these externalities in, for example, in Brazil, whether or not we think the Brazilian deforestation episode that we're now seeing is to do with mining or livestock is very much debatable when you get down on the ground and look at the data. But what is necessarily important to take into account is that there's a narrative about production externalities related to livestock in many parts of the world. On the consumption side, you can also see externalities related to, well, still mainly production, zoonosis, where you guys come in mostly, zoonosis health effects, antibiotic resistance, which is something that I'm much more interested in at the moment than climate change, and energy appropriation for food supply, so the trade-off between land use for feed or land use for energy crops. We can see other global environmental externalities, well-known ones, air pollution and global climate change through the emission of greenhouse gases. And as I said, probably the balancing output are the things that are being pushed back on when you have this debate, which are the positive outputs in terms of food production and positive public goods. So agritourism, cultural heritage, and raw materials that you see as a side product of production of animals in developing countries, so manures and so on. So the debate about livestock at the moment, as we see it, is about balancing these various external costs and public goods, which, depending on where you are in the world, receive greater or lesser attention. As I said, on an international scale, you talk to some of the multilateral agencies, like FAO, for example, they're keen to take ownership of the quantification of these effects, but they're also keen to point you towards the fact that in many parts of the world, livestock production is integral to the environment and landscapes and livelihoods. So if we inventory all of those impacts, what can we do about them in terms of policy? Well, we can actually do a lot of things. Again, a lot of this is going to come back to political economy, a point I'll make in a minute. But we can, as a policy maker, as a civil servant, we can consider voluntary compliance and information. We can consider bans and environmental standards on particular production practices. Perhaps more familiar, but more taboo, if you like, subsidies and decoupled support, which we've been long used to in the context of the Common Agricultural Policy. And more ambitiously, we can look at market-based instruments such as emissions taxes designed to tax the externality, and we can think about how those work in the context of other industrial processes like energy and aviation, where emissions taxes are actually in operation. Or, depending on who owns the property right, we can actually use such things as tradable emissions permits, which actually, in theory, work much the same way as taxes, but really there is a very, very important distinction about who owns the property right to pollute. Okay. But what are the challenges we face in actually implementing some of these tools? Well, the first one, as I've just mentioned, is the political economy of property rights, and essentially that boils down to, well, that's a nice way of saying that politicians are generally loath to and scared of renegotiating property rights. So the difference between me given a permit to pollute versus me being taxed is whether or not I am the de facto, or I'm recognised as the de facto owner of the property right to pollute. And at the moment, agriculture generally has that property right. You know, we are using voluntary influence and carrots, let's say, carrots and sermons to try and get messages across to farmers about how they produce and how they steward their livestock and how they manage those property rights. And governments have to take a very big step to move on to the next level of coercion, if you like, which is to say removing the property right and investing it in society. Okay, and that's where we kind of are at the moment with greenhouse gases and agriculture. We could have a really interesting debate about zoonoses around who has the property right, and reflecting back on many of the disease outbreaks we're all familiar with, and work out why they work and why policies don't work, depending on who we think has the property right. An important next step, or an important corollary, if you like, is the fact that we can't easily value all of the externalities I highlighted on that diagram. We've gone a long way over my career, say from 1990 to now. It's probably amazing to think how far we've come in terms of valuing greenhouse gases and internalising them through carbon markets, right? So the next question is, well, okay, when will those carbon markets actually start to work in agriculture? And if they start to work in agriculture, which other externalities can we imagine being priced into production and consumption? But there's a more, I suppose, to reflect back on the previous speakers' perspectives. Well, there's also epistemological challenges and also ethical challenges in the way we're framing the problem. Now, also by losing myself and taking you with me down this valuing externalities route, I'm giving you a kind of a vanilla mainstream economic approach to dealing with some of these problems. But there are kind of contrary voices to this approach. And I guess, well, I mean, I would maybe refer to the kind of growing area of ecological economics, but physicists, ethicists, and philosophers have been telling us an awful lot about, life on a finite planet, the limits to growth, and the fact that, we could be doing all of the most complicated calculations about the external cost of livestock and developing very, very elegant policies, but within a biosphere that actually is quite limited. We haven't got the potential to grow beyond planetary boundaries that are slowly coming into focus. And we don't really have a good idea of the safe operating space for some of the policies that I'm advocating here. And that's really a debate that's sort of ongoing. How do we define this so-called safe operating spaces and these planetary boundaries? Well, as I said, physicists have been telling us an awful lot about thermodynamics for a very long time and about entropy. Economists have been blissfully ignoring them, and the economic system is the mainstream approach to economics tells us that, well, forget the wider biosphere and the boundary that it implies. Just carry on maximising individual well-being, do all the things I've just said. Throw in a bit of circular economy, maybe, And if you're lucky, you can stay within this circle of, you know, the notional planetary boundary, where if we're lucky, we won't meet any discontinuities or irreversibilities or fall into some kind of catastrophic, irreversible state where we've just lost planetary resilience. Again, it's based on physics. The idea of, you know, the entropy in the system is simply that the economic system generates loads of pollution, and eventually the whole economic system is stuffs itself by over-pollution. It doesn't work. The counter-argument is that, well, we've got photosynthesis that so far is still working, and also we're getting more ingenious in two ways. We're inventing, or maybe deluding ourselves with the idea that we can invent the so-called circular economy inside this circle, and just keeps magically growing, but not getting out to this boundary. And that's sort of the latest, if you like, the latest rhetoric that's keeping us all kind of enthralled in the idea that we've got space to manoeuvre. Other technological optimists, like, for example, Martin Weitzman, I don't know if anybody heard of him. He's one of the best people in the world that never won an economics Nobel Prize, and who just unfortunately committed suicide. He actually had the view that that humanity is so ingenious that we can continue to grow here, and we'll find ways to push this out. But of course, we'll never know whether we will never be around to test that hypothesis. Notwithstanding all those arguments, technical innovation and so on, that we can't count on, there's more development around the idea of planetary boundaries. In this case, the Stockholm Resilience Institute have decided to develop some metrics to make this look more manageable and more meaningful. And of course, when you start looking at these metrics, you start being able to identify where livestock fits, the livestock contribution to the metrics, where we are obviously notionally across some boundary or notionally within some boundary. And I'd just point out, although it's on the next slide, that when I first looked at this, I didn't see antimicrobial resistance, which I would argue is we're probably over the boundary on that metric, and it's a kind of a glaring error on their part. Just when I thought that, the next slide is pretty awful actually, but it comes from the RISE Foundation, which is I guess it's a lobby group in Brussels who have taken that last framework and have tried to make it walk and talk in terms of livestock production. So here you see various categories of livestock impact down this first column here, somewhat like the categories you just saw on that previous diagram, and then they've tried to work out, well, okay, what do these metrics actually look like, and have we got any data? And I suppose in terms of the things, sorry, that should have gone. Let's go back. Excuse me while I just find that again. In terms of the categories that I guess you guys are interested in, it's these ones here: AMR and zoonoses and animal welfare. They just come up short in terms of measurable, metrics that actually make any sense in the context of a planetary boundary. Am I over my time, or am I doing okay? I'm nearly done, I think. Okay, well, so that's all complicated, and yeah, I mean, it's, as I said, it's useful rhetoric for guiding global conversations, but actually, closer to home, the debate is happening around something called sustainable intensification, which I guess is, in my opinion, reframing redefining resource use efficiency, maximising output per unit of input, but also whatever you put on the numerator and the denominator, you include input and output externalities that I showed you on that rather complicated diagram. And that includes searching for win-wins and synergies and improving animal health and its effect on greenhouse gases, which I think EPIC has done a lot of work on. And that's where we are at the moment. And the question is, well, okay, is that enough? Is that all we can hope to do? Well, maybe, maybe not. Turns out that there are additional pressures that if we sit and do nothing, then we're going to get clobbered anyway, not least, you know, the various dilemmas about parts per million concentration of greenhouse gases, inexorable growth in human population, and therefore the dilemma of what all these new people on Earth are going to consume. And not only that, then you can add, the various, as I said before, if we are hitting some planetary boundary, are we tipping ourselves into some resilient state, a non-resilient state, which we can't get out of, and there's various devices you can use from the Stockholm Resilience Institute to demonstrate what that actually means. But it also means, and referring back to my original, I suppose, provocation definition, if you like, of sustainability, non-declining well-being, it also includes the fact that just in general we're not really getting happier, it would seem to me. And if we go into, if we dwell long enough in the livestock debate, nobody is really laughing about it. And in fact, the general hysteria is ramping up. Maybe it's just me. Maybe I just spend too much time alighting on these sort of articles and journal papers. And I certainly get sent a lot of papers to referee about, well, okay, what do we do about livestock? I'm not sure that there's fewer people researching this and sounding the alarm. So where does it leave us? Well, okay, the last IPCC report is telling us, well, not moralising, but certainly telling us what we've got to do. And actually, coming back to the original word soup of a title, the idea of growing populations and us trying to outstrip the effect of growing populations consuming livestock through available measures of sustainable intensification doesn't make me feel very optimistic. And I think, given what I just said about the growing discourse around livestock consumption and livestock shaming, like flight shaming, I don't think this is going to go away. And the question is how do we engage with it? How do you engage with some of the things that are to do with measurement, internalising, recognising north-south dichotomies, and recognising that there may well be some planetary boundaries that we have to investigate. So we could do that, or we could just wait and see what happens. This is going back a while. I mean, when you grow, you generally consume more stuff and you consume more meat. I don't know, I wouldn't put a line through that, I might put a curve through it. But if I was looking if I had a fertile imagination and thought about a lot of the literature some of it has been debunked through the last 3 decades or more on the relationship between growth and environmental pollution, then I might posit that given the structure of the data points that I just showed you, probably need an updated version and a better econometrician or statistician. We might think that if we just wait and see, growing education and health awareness will lead us to a point where we just hit an apex and then start to decline in terms of our consumption. I don't know whether the world can wait that long, but it's a hypothesis that we might want to sit and wait and see what happens. If not, then there are other things governments can do. And rather like the production side, they can include the following: voluntary compliance and information to me and you as consumers, bans on stuff that we can and can't eat, consumption taxes, rather like production taxes, tradable emissions permits and licenses. If we're heading towards kind of personal carbon credits, then they'll probably have to extend to all of the things we do in our consumer behaviours. Okay, so basically to conclude, I'm not sure what time. This is kind of, again, a generic kind of wish list of stuff that kind of follows from what I've been discussing. Pay full price of food without affecting food security. It's a big ask. Pricing negative externalities and rewarding positive ones. Consolidating the valuation of natural capital more generally. So it's understanding public goods and externalities and understanding how we value them consistently. That's the next point. Improving livestock systems, so that's following the sustainable intensification agenda, which is a bit of a no-brainer, and that includes things like improved genetics and breeding. On the consumption side, it's promoting and supporting healthy diets and emphasising the role of consumers. That seems to be mainstream now, and helping consumers have be aware of what their choices entail and helping them make good choices. And in case you wanted to go back to that rise, that crowded rise slide on safe operating spaces and metrics, then there's a nice report on the first URL here. And the other one I'd bring your attention to, although it's gone a bit quiet recently, is the so-called TEEB initiative, which is the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which is a UN initiative of the last 5-10 years, which has actually tried to go heavily into understanding externalities of food production. And a lot of this information has just been taken from them. Thank you.
Okay.
This is where you get to provoke.
Yeah, well, I was going to provoke you, actually. And you seem to dance around this idea of growth is bad, this sort of degrowth option. And I'd like to know a little bit more about equity in terms of, okay, we have the graphic where we have growth and we're all going to change, and degrowth and be happier people, but then the world is unequal. And even in this country, we have a lot of poverty as well. In terms of the choices.
I suppose, dancing around it sounds like, constructive. And no, insofar as I recognise the unequal incidence of this agenda, it was only in terms of that slide where I highlighted the pushback. Look, okay, let's kind of acknowledge the hysteria around the negative externalities from livestock, which we're all doing, I think. Recognise that actually this agenda to do something about it in policy terms depends on where you are in the world. And as, say, the FAO will constantly point out, there are places in the world where you can't implement these things because people are living tenuous lives and they're livestock dependent, their livelihoods are dependent on livestock, and it doesn't make sense. So there has to be some, I suppose, agenda around where in the world we are going to have to tolerate production. And actually within your own country, I mean, on the consumption side, I think that's an interesting point. I mean, what do we do with other taxes on consumption? Do we vary them? Do we means test? I don't know. It's a good question.
Thank you. I'm not going to have two economic professors arguing.
Well, there's the third one if she wants to say something.
Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah.
Any questions? Oh, at the back there.
So we're bound to disagree.
Got three opinions.
Andy McGowan, really interesting talks, both of them. I'm struck, and I know you said at the beginning this was very much a classical economic approach to it, but it also reflects government and world government approaches to it, and I wonder if this is a glaring failure of exactly what the first talk was addressing. So our lack of global progress in finding ways of squaring the circle that still allow livestock production and producers sustainably and consumers to have enough wholesome food to eat, because then amongst this ethical debate, I would say malnutrition and so on is at times gets forgotten. And if we have a way of producing livestock as efficiently as possible, do we not also have a duty to do that and to address some of the distribution issues that mean that that gets to the right places? But it's these cultural things and the anthropology of it which seems to be glaringly absent from any of the debate, and has been from anything I've been watching over the last 10 or 15 years in relation to climate change. There's a single approach to it, and the IPCC represents that. It's their way, it's their measurement systems. This is what the impact is. There doesn't seem to be all that much debate about alternative approaches to it, how you do it.
Yeah, I mean, let's not be too hard on ourselves. We've come a long way. Maybe we've hit, we're at a junction now where we do have, both Andrew's question and yours are the questions. I think we roughly know what to do when we have systems that are polluting. Okay, implement the polluter pays principle. It's tough politically, that's the political economy challenge, and also it's part of that political economy challenge is, well, okay, there will be social incidents, and we haven't really started to address that. Nobody really has. I mean, okay, we look at carbon prices and carbon taxes in energy and other spheres where they're implemented, then there's a lot of analysis and of the incidence of implementation. I don't know. Well, I mean, I suppose Deb. I mean, sorry, I'm looking at you because you have an economy-wide model, maybe, and people who analyse taxes can tell us a bit about the incidence of taxes. So it's not a huge leap of the imagination that we've got the tools to do it. It's whether or not we want to extend these approaches that I particularly highlighted here, and I wouldn't die in a ditch for them, by the way, if somebody can tell me something else. If you know, we get a good picture of, well, like, how can we implement them fairly? Can we implement them fairly? What does it mean? What does it mean to be taxed on my consumption of emissions-intensive food? How does it work? Do I, again, coming back to my political economy challenge of the property right, who has the property right? And do you remove it from consumers and give it back to them in some other form? Or do you just allow them to actually learn, which is a slow boil?
Sorry, can I just say one thing? Dominic, you mentioned both on the production side and the consumption side the potential for permits, tradable permits. And to me, they seem quite a good way of getting around this issue about this issue about distributional effects, because they're a very good economic instrument. The problem is they're brilliant in theory, but they're really, really hard to apply. So it'd be interesting to get an idea of how far away you think we are from that on both sides, on the production side and on the consumption side. And the other issue I was just going to ask you a little bit about, which was quite something you said right at the outset about post-millennials and how different they are, and the impact that that's going to have on the political economy in effect over time. I think that's something it would be interesting to hear you
maybe taking your last point first. I've got no sense other than, well, we all have the only sense of the rapidity of change and behavioural changes, our own lifespan, and actually it's been quite fast really when you think about, you know, I was sitting in a room with somebody who was modelling global climate change with his PhD, and I was sitting there looking at him thinking, well, that'll never catch on. And actually that became a carbon price. It's like, God, you know, I did the wrong PhD. And that was not long ago. Now, what's happening in our kids' lifetime is actually, I think it's accelerating, and actually it's changing consumer taste based around information. And whether that's a permanent change, I get the sense that it kind of is. Well, I don't know, I suppose I should be encouraged by that because information is coming from somewhere and people are working with it. Coming back to your second point, your first point was about tradable permits. Yeah, I agree with your at the outset. I mean, behavioural economists will tell us that there's something called loss aversion, and actually removing the property right from people is very difficult because people don't like losses. They value losses in a different way than they do gains, and actually if you tax people rather than the almost theoretically equivalent, giving them the right to pollute and then just letting them exercise the right or sell it to somebody else, which is kind of neat and theoretically efficient, then they don't feel that they've been hoodwinked and conned. But as you say, Deb, it's how do we make that political jump? Somebody's going to do it. My bet is that California will do it. Because in California, there's kind of novel carbon pricing all over the place. And agriculture is in an emissions trading scheme. And I can see livestock going into their trading scheme. And I can see it in China, actually, because where, you know, the governance is a bit different, but they do stuff and they do it, they go for it. The challenge comes on the consumption side version of that. I mean, yeah, there's papers on personal carbon credits. And it doesn't sound like a mad idea. And if I can exercise my right to offset my flight or not take the flight in the first place, then why would I feel so bad about somebody else actually allocating my right? Are we getting, in that generation that's coming, are we getting somewhere nearer where that is an acceptable property right situation? I get the sense it is. Yeah.
Thanks, Dominic. That's an interesting point to follow through. I suppose you mentioned as well the do-nothing scenario, and we're talking about this rapid change in the next generation.
Yeah, I think there's do nothing isn't really do nothing, is it? I mean, if we could just wait and see how consumption solves this, or does it solve it?
Yeah, which
Thank you. Sheila Vose, Chief Vet. Can I be provocative?
Yeah, that's the point.
It's not like me to ask. It may simply be the function of where we are and the fact that this is the centre of expertise for animal disease outbreaks. But talking about sustainable agriculture, it's not that animal production is bad and non-animal production is good. So is there similar work going on in some of the other areas? I mean, I find myself thinking about almond production in California, for example, which takes a lot of inputs and is not necessarily better than sheep production in the northwest of Scotland, for example. I mean, I'm not an expert in the area, but I do wonder if we're comparing like for like and looking across the spectrum.
Yeah, I mean, to paraphrase, are we getting a clear picture of the relative external cost, life cycle effects and so on of different production systems? I think we're getting there, yeah. I think that whole teed thing I mentioned, actually it's there. That was what they set out to do, and then discovered that actually it's quite hard to do globally, but you know, if you start collecting data somewhere, you get somewhere. But yeah, by and large, we're on the right track, I think. And I think animal diseases, and I didn't have time to really dwell on the idiosyncrasies of animal diseases, different market-based instruments we can implement to deal with some of this, like insurance, for example. I haven't really spent much time on the ins and outs and the behavioural changes and the property right implications of insurance, but we're getting there, and there are people thinking about it.
Okay, thank you, Dominic. There's a question.
Thank you both. This is a question about the utopia of these systems, because I'm completely ignorant. But have you guys explored, or somebody else, what would it take to have an actual real cost of the production, so we can understand what actual sustainable planetary health mean? And I'll contextualize the question by saying, in the not so distant past, resource availability dictated the cost of a product. And I'm not an expert in economics, but here is the question. What has happened over time in this ambition to make goods, commodities that everyone can enjoy? Seems like the cost and the challenges associated with that are being passed on to different things rather than the actual retribution of the environment and restoration of the inputs and outputs in that chain for the profit of some. So could you talk a little bit about that?
So there seem to be several questions in your question. I mean, what does the world look like that actually, I suppose, I mean, we tried to think a bit about, you know, what is optimal livestock globally?
How much would it cost?
Well, what would it look like? I mean, if you minimised, it's an optimization problem, global optimization problem. The answer is nobody's done it. It'd be a bit bespoke and a bit crude, but it would have livestock being, you know, for analytical purposes in certain parts of the world where you minimise the external costs, and then you probably have instruments to minimise the consumption costs as well. But nobody has done that. Nobody has done that. You mentioned something towards the end of your contribution there, and it's regeneration or something. Did you come? So that was a bit of jargon I never threw into this talk, but that seems to be another regenerative agriculture.
Well, restoring the sources from where our food sources come from. So in my view, you know, in a system that is approaching perfection, you eat what you need, and through that process you try to give back to the environment and leave it in the state that you found it. But that doesn't seem to be happening.
Well, I think maybe, and I'm probably not totally accurate on this, but when I was groping towards this concept of the circular economy, there is something in that. You know, is what can you recycle effectively, and cut out some of the costs that I've been mentioning. Yeah, I mean, it sounds a bit too good to be true, but there is enough evidence to show that.
Frida Scott Park. I'm a veterinary surgeon, but I also farm organically. We have a small beef system. And it just occurred to me on one of your slides, one of your solutions was good agricultural practices. And I wonder, with your sort of global view, you know, people have laughed at organic farmers for many years, but I think with the rise in veganism and the conversion to eating vast amounts of plant material, people have always said that organic farmers will never feed the world, you know, in the context of livestock production. But we take great pride, actually, in farming with high welfare standards to minimize antimicrobial use, putting the liquid gold, which we consider our slurry system, to be back in the soil. The soil is really important for our grass growth, particularly in the west of Scotland, where I come from. A bit of sunshine helps as well. But, you know, I do think maybe a better explanation of what you meant under that solutions bit, good agricultural practices, and how they are delivered in different parts of the world, because they won't be the same in Scotland as they are in South America. No,
I think, I mean, maybe organic sets the bar high as the way we define it and the way we certify, but I mean, yeah, absolutely, you answered your own question. Good agricultural practice is being defined in different parts of the world and implemented, and the question might well be an adoption problem, where markets do not adequately reward people who convert over time periods that are quite long sometimes, and where, you know, where actually, well, I suppose where organic markets don't work. There is something that approximates good practice, and we know what that is. We know what that is to reduce emissions. We know what that is in terms of animal husbandry. And again, if in an ideal world you'd have governments that reward that, right, that would make up the loss that producers suffer from conversion, or where markets can't reward, because they're public goods.
I think that brings me on to the point about there were sort of support for conversion to organic, wasn't there? And you mentioned subsidies as well.
Yeah,
and how distorting these subsidies are.
Yeah, it's interesting. I really hesitated about putting that in as an instrument, but it's an instrument. So I don't know. Did anybody notice in the Guardian yesterday there was a snippet on this land use, another day, another land use report about how doomed we are. But basically, it was saying how many trillion. I mean, the misdirected subsidies. If only we can make the wage and measure on and put all those subsidies towards positive public goods, and it'll be great, you know. But the problem, I mean, it's a double-edged sword, because I'm talking about renegotiation of property rights in terms of, say, negative externalities, but at the same time hinting that, you know, people need to be subsidised to bring positive public goods, and sometimes that doesn't sit well together.
No.
But I don't want to say that in a room full of farmers. Or a room full of people who are going to talk to me.
But then the rhetoric to flip to pay for public goods.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a very subtle, depending on which country you're in, you have a very subtle debate about what is a public good that merits subsidisation. And then we get into, over the last however many years, is food a public good? And one has to argue, well, no, it isn't, because the market will. Yeah.
Sorry.
Are you done?
We need 5 more minutes.
So I just was thinking about folding in the previous talk to some of the things that you've been discussing. And again, going back to this idea of different views of animals and animal agency. And, you know, a lot of economics, and again, I'm not an expert, so feel free to rubbish what I'm about to say, seems to be about willingness to pay. You know, how much are individuals, human individuals, willing to pay for things? So if you add in the factors of animal agency and, you know, how do we view animals? Animals are not willing to pay anything to be slaughtered. So does that change the methodologies, or are there methodologies in economics to deal with those things, or are they being developed, or how do you view it?
That's a good point. I mean, not to rephrase your question, if agency were different, would this story be different? Well, clearly yes. Animals wouldn't submit themselves to slaughter, and or would grow in different conditions to have happy and fruitful lives and so on. Sorry, I don't know if I've got that right, but the answer is no. I mean, we're not making. I mean, the agency. This is, as I said at the beginning and at the outset, unashamedly instrumental and anthropocentric, and yeah, I mean, and it is a good contrast to the first talk in that respect, I suppose. But yeah, I mean, I think we're not making much progress in considering the consequences of agency being, I suppose we are talking about animal welfare, really, or disease states, or naturalness, or I think there was a discussion about infection. That got me quickly thinking about, well, okay, are we living within a very determined paradigm of what naturalness is and what we want, and what we decide to stamp on or to incentivize. It's an interesting philosophical debate, because it does actually tend to influence, well, all of these policies that are going to get us out of this hole for now.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, but even keeping within the anthropocentric view, you know, there is an increasing proportion of society who view these animal agency questions as being important. And so you can fold it into that somehow, but I just...
Yeah. Oh, no. Okay, now I get your point. I mean, no, for that sector of consumers who have preferences over production and consumption that might be different from mine, and actually maybe a bit extreme in terms of their willingness.
And keep in mind that I'm not a vegan or vegetarian at all.
I can't find the right words without upsetting somebody. But I mean, you know, if people are willing to pay, and as you said, it comes back down to that. If I'm willing to make the sacrifices, then anything is largely possible as long as enough people want to as well. Yeah, I mean, we know from consumer research that there is a segment that will stump up and have very, very defined preferences over production and consumption practices. Yeah. They're just not big enough.
No, but I guess I'm thinking as well that, you know, you could almost view, if those views become more prevalent, then the view of animals as independent agents means that it's no longer just about human willingness to pay. The calculations presumably then have to take in explicitly those agents, and the view changes considerably. So that still stays anthropocentric in the sense that it accounts for the human desire to include those viewpoints, but then it jumps outside of it because of those human desires.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose we I'm not going to answer this question very well, but we get to some sense of incommensurability in terms of I suppose the standard economic model of making trade-offs. Yeah, when you have so-called kind of almost a lexicographic where, you know, trade-offs are not nicely convex stuff. There are safe minimum standards, in other words, for certain livestock states, I guess it amounts to. Then it's not bad. I mean, we have those for conservation of wild biodiversity. There are just minimum standards for populations. Why don't we apply those to animal welfare standards? Again, though, it's not costless. There's a trade-off. We just have to make it explicit.
Yeah, no, that's useful comments. Thanks.
I think time for one last point.
Sorry, this might be a massive mistake because my voice has gone. But I was just sitting thinking about the fact that the first speaker spoke a lot about our relationship with animals in this country. I hope I'm getting this correct, and that animals are sort of inherently dirty or diseased. And then I guess that also follows through into the idea of climate change, how animals have become a bit of a scapegoat in some circumstances. Again, echoing this idea that they're somehow dirty or polluting. And then also it fills into the welfare debate that we believe that animals can survive in animals that are inherent in conditions that are inherently dirty. And I wonder whether at a certain point we need to break that paradigm that animals are inherently dirty and consider them as part of our society, and whether that changes the way we think about disease, about climate change, about antimicrobial resistance, and about animal welfare. I'm not sure whether I'm expecting an answer. It was just something that sprung into my head.
It's a nice observation. I mean, let's remind ourselves that we are the ones with agency. And just about everything we're talking about, infection, disease, emissions. I mean, animals, the counterfactual to us having agency relative to them is who knows what. I mean, we're here and we're here to stay. Well, we are kind of here to stay. And animals are therefore, part of our dominion. And therefore, then we demonise. Sorry, I haven't even got your language to. This is your language, but sorry. It's important. It's an important thing to step back and remind ourselves. I mean, the agency is us. Then you quite rightly say. Then we demonise. We've invented a language of, well, effectively in my case, pollution, and inserted animals into that narrative, which they weren't there. I mean, they might have been for slurry, but who cared 20 or 30 years ago? Now they're four square in the climate change narrative. And that's actually happened, well, not exactly overnight, but it actually has changed. It's changed the debate in ways that I don't think many of us anticipated. Demonisation, maybe it's a genie out of the bottle, and I don't know how to put it back in and to restore a balance between human and animal agency. But it's a very, very good observation. I don't know how to answer it.
Well, I think you kind of answered it there, I think. But thank you. We could go on and on about this, I think, and I think we've raised a lot of interesting points, probably for further discussion as well.
So read the reports as well.
I'll read the reports as well. Yeah, so if you could thank Dominic for his time.